we live in a world where it's pretty normal to only consider things like cereal, muffins, and bagels as our traditional breakfast foods.
That's right.
How would you have us rethink about breakfast so that we can optimize our metabolic health, our gut health, and our longevity?
Great question. Great question. I'm going to put intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating aside because it doesn't really matter if you do a 12-hour fast, 14, 16-hour, whatever your first meal is matters. And you're 100% right. Essentially, the world is eating dessert for breakfast. Most cereals are 75% sugar. It shouldn't be called breakfast. It should be called dessert. And whether it's that or it's a Frappuccino from Starbucks or a bagel or a muffin or pancakes or French toast or waffles or just, even worse, things like Pop-Tarts and things that kids eat for breakfast. I used to eat Pop-Tarts for breakfast when I was a kid. It's absolutely the worst thing we can do because when you start your day with sugar for breakfast instead of protein and fat for breakfast, a whole cascade gets tipped off that is going to ultimately cause you to end up gaining weight and feeling like crap, potentially lead to diabetes, and for sure probably pre-diabetes. And the reason is when our first meal is sugar or something that turns into sugar, because anything that's flour is equivalent. Below the neck, your body can't tell the difference between a bowl of sugar and a bowl of cornflakes or a bowl of sugar and a couple of pieces of toast. It's exactly the same when it hits your body. In fact, the bread is probably worse because it's got a higher glycemic index and it raises your insulin more. Although sugar is fructose and glucose, so it's a little bit of a different molecule, but it's still bad. So what happens is you kick into this cascade where you drive up insulin. That's the fat storage hormone. You store belly fat. You partition the fat, which means it gets locked in there like a one-way turnstile on the underground, where basically you can get in, but you can't get out. So the fat gets locked in there. It slows your metabolism, and it makes you hungry. So if you have oatmeal for breakfast, which we think is a healthy breakfast, it's kind of the least unhealthy of the unhealthy breakfast. It's not as bad as sugary cereals or a muffin. But it still raises your insulin, raises your adrenaline, raises your cortisol, raises your blood sugar, raises your triglycerides, and it then causes this spike in insulin and then a crash in your blood sugar. And that leads to this kind of up and down craving cycle that we all experience, and we end up eating more. So if you have, for example, looking at a study from Dr. Ludwig, it was a brilliant study. He gave people an omelet, steel-cut oats, or instant oatmeal. 3 breakfasts, same calories, so identical calories. They were overweight young kids. And they then put them in a room and they said, okay, eat these breakfasts. And then whenever you're hungry, hit the button, tell us, we'll bring you more food. The kids who had the oatmeal ate 86% more food in that day than the kids who ate the omelet. And the kids who ate the steel-cut oats ate 56% more food than the kids who ate the omelet. So whether it's steel-cut oats, you can modify steel-cut oats and put nuts in there. You can put butter in there. You can put flax seeds in there. You can put fiber in there. You can change the composition. But at the end of the day, the glycemic load of your meal matters the most. And you want to start the day with protein and ideally fat. So it could be a protein shake with some MCT oil in it. It could be an omelet with avocados and tomatoes, and olive oil. It could be a nut shake that I talked about in my 10-day detox diet, which essentially you put seeds and nuts and good fats in there with protein and fiber and some frozen berries. It can be delicious. It doesn't have to be bad. But what it's going to prevent you from doing is ending up in this roller coaster of blood sugar swings, of cravings, of overeating, of eating too much sugar and starch, craving carbs, of gaining weight, of getting belly fat, of getting in this cascade of metabolic dysfunction, which is terrible in America. It's 93% of us are somewhere in that continuum. I don't know what it's in the UK, but you guys are probably not far behind us. And so it's pretty bad. And so the best thing you can do for yourself for breakfast is to start the day with protein and fat.
It's interesting that both you and I are very passionate about root cause medicine. We're always thinking, well, how do we get to the root cause of this problem instead of just suppressing symptoms, often with medications? But if we think about breakfast, it's looking at root cause through a slightly different lens. It's almost like a root cause behavior that if we don't get right has multiple downstream implications for the rest of our day. Do you know what I mean? It's like quite similar.
Absolutely. It's a slippery slope. When you start your breakfast with sugar in any form that we talked about, it's going to create a day where you're going to end up in a metabolic cascade that is undermining your health. It's making you hungrier. That's making you crave more carbs and sugar. It's making you eat more food in general. And ultimately, day after day after day, what's going to happen? You're going to gain a lot of weight and you're going to gain belly fat and you're going to get into this metabolic crisis, which we see so much of the world in today, which is the spectrum of prediabetes and type 2 diabetes.
When you were talking about all the consequences of starting the day with sugar, two of the things you mentioned were adrenaline and cortisol. Now, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because people, they might go, belly fat and triglycerides, which is a harmful form of cholesterol, but adrenaline and cortisol are stress hormones. So what's the relationship between our breakfast and our stress levels?
Great question. So Dr. Ludwig, in this study, he hooked these kids up to an IV and he would draw their blood very frequently. And he could see the response in their blood of all these biomarkers, your blood sugar, your insulin, your adrenaline, your cortisol, or your triglycerides and other things that change quickly. And what he found was that the kids who ate sugar for breakfast, and when I say sugar for breakfast, I mean oatmeal and steel cut oats, which isn't half as bad as most kids are eating. What happened was the cortisol went up. So when you eat sugar and starch, it's like a stress on your body. The body perceives it as a physiological stress. It's not a mental stress, like where someone's yelling at you, or you're in a fight, or you almost, get an accident, you feel this rush of cortisol and adrenaline. It's a physiological response to eating a food that creates higher levels of these stress hormones in your body. And again, that's bad because when you have higher levels of cortisol over time, one, you gain more belly fat, you get high blood pressure, you get diabetes, you lose muscle, you lose bone density, you cause cognitive impairment. It can lead to dementia over time when you see high cortisol levels. And we see this, it shrinks the hippocampus, the memory center of the brain. And so you end up in this horrible kind of snowball effect. And it's not just the sugar, it's also the cortisol. So you want to eat a diet that doesn't stress you out, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that's crazy, isn't it, to think about this idea that our breakfast can literally stress our body out. Again, it's just broadening the lens through which we look at food. Food is not just calories, it's not just energy. As you've said, for many, many years, food is information. And in fact, if I have it here, in your last book, for me, there was a real magic in that book that I really enjoyed. And one of the things you wrote in that book was the single biggest input to your biology is what you eat every day. And the information in that food is changing your biology in real time. That's what you're talking about, isn't it?
100%. Because remember what I said about this study. They were identical calories. So even though there was the same amount of energy in the food, the information in the food was different. And how that information was translated into biological signals was different depending on the quality and the type of food that we're eating.
Yeah.
So the information is changing your hormones, it's changing your brain chemistry, it's changing your microbiome, it's changing your immune system, and many, many other things, your mitochondrial function, your stress hormones, your insulin hormones, your sex hormones. All of that's affected by what you're eating. And people don't understand that. They think, it's just calories in, calories out. You want to lose weight, eat less, exercise more. Unfortunately, that blames the victim. And it's not such a simplistic view. Yes, energy matters and energy calories matter, but you have to understand it's the quality of the calories that matter. So when you focus on what you eat, you don't have to worry so much about how much you eat.
Yeah.
And there's been many, many trials by David Ludwig and others looking at basically unlimited calories, but changing the composition of the diet so that the information is different. So you can do a calorie restricted diet, that's, for example, low fat versus a low starch sugar diet that's unrestricted calories. And the group that has the unrestricted calories will eat less and be less hungry and weigh less at the end of the study and have better metabolic health.
Yeah. Mark, I want to make sure that everyone listening or watching really understands the gravity of what you're saying. Okay. Now, there's a few things you mentioned. You mentioned bread sometimes is worse than sugary cereal. You mentioned oatmeal, which a lot of people consider to be a healthy breakfast. So let me just zoom out a minute and go, if 93% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy, and let's say it's a probably not quite as high, but comparable in the UK and in many other countries around the world now. Is it that these foods are particularly problematic on the backdrop of poor metabolic health, i.e., if you went to a population somewhere where they were in exceptional metabolic health and they were exquisitely insulin sensitive, do you think they could eat those foods like bread and oatmeal without it having those negative consequences?
Yes, but. Yes, but. Yes, maybe for a few days. But after a few days, what starts to happen is you start to adapt to this different diet. I mean, look, there were populations that were exquisitely metabolically sensitive, like the Pima Indians in Southwest America, where there was zero diabetes, zero obesity, zero heart disease, zero metabolic dysfunction at the turn of the 1900s. And now 80% have diabetes by the time they're 30. They're the second most obese population in the world after the Samoans. Why? Because the government of the United States gave them government surplus food, which consisted of three main things: flour, white sugar, and white fat, otherwise known as Crisco or shortening. And those three things really were the death of this population. So even though they were exquisitely insulin sensitive, over time, if you feed someone who's metabolically healthy, metabolically unhealthy food, they will become metabolically unhealthy. Even myself. I mean, if I'm fit and I'm healthy and my insulin level's low and my A1C is really low and my blood sugar is good and my blood pressure is good and my triglycerides are low and my HDL is high, all that could change if I just started a diet of the average American person, which is 60% processed food and 152 pounds of sugar and 133 pounds of flour a year. So if I ate that much of that stuff, I guarantee you I would not be looking like I do now.
It's the key thing there, Mark, whether the food is highly processed or not. And the reason I say that is because there are some populations, aren't there, around the world who are having quite high carb diets, but the carbs are sweet potatoes. Yeah. They are, whole food carbohydrates, and they seem to still be in good health. So what I'm wondering is, in your view, do we have like the perfect storm at the moment where it's all of this ultra processed food and we've got a metabolically unhealthy population and we're not moving enough and we're overly stressed and we're underslept? You put all these things together, and would you even say that some of us are unable to tolerate even whole food carbs? Or is it just the ultra processed carbs that are the main issue?
It depends how busted your metabolism is. Right? Yeah. So if you're a generally healthy person, you want to chew on sugar cane, great. You want to eat wheat berries, no problem. But when you start consuming larger amounts of flour and refined sugars, because these are refined foods, they're highly processed. Now, they may not be ultra processed in the sense of deconstructed and put in strange forms and had all kinds of food additives and what we call ultra processed food. But even so, they're highly refined foods and they're quickly metabolized and absorbed. And we didn't even have refined flour until like the 120, 30, 40, 50 years ago when they invented the flour mill and the electric flour mill, and we got, the Industrial Revolution, because you had to grind stuff pretty hard. I remember living in China for a while, and I went to this remote village, and there were these two guys with these two giant stones with sticks in them that were grinding flour by walking around in circles like mules for like hours to grind their flour. And I guarantee you that's never going to get to be like what we see in America, where they completely remove the grain from the bran and the germ, which are the fiber and the nutrient-containing components. So I think if you're looking at populations, for example, like we were visiting the Hadza, they eat a lot of tubers and they eat starchy vegetables, but they eat also 150 grams of fiber. So if you took a Coca-Cola and you put in like 2 or 3 tablespoons of Metamucil, it's going to have a different impact on your biology because you're adding fiber to it. And I'm not suggesting you do that, but it's really about the composition of the whole diet, not just one food. And we call this dietary patterns, and we call this, particularly around sugar, the glycemic load of the meal. So how much is the total load? So if you have oatmeal by itself, that's a problem. But if you add fat and you add protein and you add more fiber, it's going to change the load of that meal so that it doesn't spike your blood sugar as much. So the key here is, what are the foods that are spiking blood sugar and insulin the most? And if you're susceptible, and there's probably 75% of the world's population is susceptible to this because we were hunter-gatherers, because we were in adapted to high sugar starch diets. we're going to end up in trouble. Now, certain populations are much worse. If you look at the Native American population in the U.S., indigenous populations, if you look at Pacific Islanders, the East Indians like yourself,
Yeah.
even at lower weights, you're going to get metabolic dysfunction. That's why there's such high rates of diabetes and heart disease in India. If you look at African Americans, Asians, even at lower weights, will become metabolically dysfunctional when they eat a diet that's high in starch and sugar. And you can say, oh, look, the Chinese, they ate so much rice. They did. But I traveled and lived in China. I speak Chinese. I understand the culture. And, you go see these skinny Chinese guys eating giant bowls of white rice. But what you also had to understand was that they were out there in the rice fields 12 hours a day working their butt off. So they burned it all off.
Yeah. It's interesting. We're seeing more and more endurance athletes, competitive athletes, winning triathlons for years and, all kinds of things coming out now with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, which is really shaking things up for people because these guys are considered healthy. They're exercising loads. They're competing at a high level. I'm not saying everyone, but many of them are having these highly processed, high carb diets because they've been told that this is necessary to fuel them. But for some of them, it's coming at quite a serious consequence. Yes, maybe a gold medal, but at the same time, 20, 30 years of living with type 2 diabetes, right? And then you've got to go, well, is this a good trade? Might there be another way of doing this? And I know Professor Tim Noakes is doing a lot of work on this and trying to show that maybe there are other ways to have elite performance, which don't necessarily require these high carb diets.
Exactly. Yeah. I think, Peter Attia gave a great TED Med talk years ago where he talked about he was just an endurance athlete. He would swim from Los Angeles to Catalina Island, which is extremely far in the ocean, and do all these endurance sports. And he was using all these goos, which is pure sugar, and found out he had prediabetes. And how does an endurance athlete have prediabetes? Well, if you're constantly loading your body with insulin, spiking sugars, you're going to end up with kind of marbled muscle. You're going to end up with a little bit extra belly fat, and that's all it takes.
Yeah.
There's very interesting theories around sort of sugar and starch, but the trick is when you start eating these foods, it starts this cascade where you get hungry fat. David Lidwick talks about this. So the belly fat, the fat around your middle, is actually hungry fat, and it makes you hungry. Again, it's stored in there because of the insulin. It doesn't get out easily, and so it slows your metabolism, and you end up in this, horrible cascade where it's a vicious cycle. And the only way to break it is to stop eating those starches and sugars for a period of time. And it's really why I created my 10-day detox diet, to get people to reset their metabolism. And it's basically getting rid of starch and sugar, having nuts and seeds, which have some starch, and you can have some berries, which have some sugar, and lots of fiber, and lots of vegetables, and good quality fats, and good quality protein. And what happens to people is they can get off all their meds in a few months if they stick to it, because we see these dramatic shifts in their biology very quickly. People don't realize how biologically addictive some of these foods are. According to the Yale Food Addiction Scale, which is a validated metric that's used by Yale University and the food addiction program there to understand how to evaluate if someone's a food addict, just like if you're an alcoholic. And what they found is, and this is a global study of, I think, I don't know how many, it was like dozens of countries. And they found that 14% of the world's population is biologically addicted to food. Not just I have a few cravings for candy, but like biologically addicted. They go through withdrawal. They have cravings that interfere with their life. There's all these criteria. And 14% of kids are also food addicted. Now, 14% of adults are alcoholic, but 14% of kids are not. So we got 14% of kids and adults who are biologically addicted. And what happens is it changes your brain function. Again, it's a very elegant study done. I call it the milkshake study, where they looked at a group of overweight guys, and they did two different milkshakes, and they did a washout period in between where they weren't, eating anything except their normal diet. The first milkshake and they were identical in calories, in protein, in fat, in carbs, in fiber. So they're identical, and they tasted the same through some magic of food engineering, except one had a very quickly spiking blood sugar type of carbohydrate, and the other had a more slow metabolizing type of carbohydrate as the carbohydrate. The ones who had the high, quickly released, high sugar, high insulin spiking carbs had all the same things. They had high insulin, they had cortisol, adrenaline, all those things we mentioned. And when they looked at functional MRIs, their brain imaging, they found that their brains lit up in the same area as is activated by cocaine or heroin. So when you think about that for a minute, it's called the nucleus accumbens. This area of the brain
Mhm.
is your addiction center. It's your pleasure center. And so when people were eating this basically sugary milkshake, it lit up the addiction center in the brain. Now, for some of us, we may be able to manage that. Like just like some of us can have a glass or two of wine, we don't become alcoholics, and other people do. There's some genetics involved in this. But it's important to understand that these foods are highly regulating many aspects of your biology, including your brain chemistry.
Did you say that it was 14, as in 14% of children are showing signs of being addicted to foods?
Yeah, and adults.
And adults. That's a staggering number, isn't it? I mean, Mark,
It is.
it's very clear to me, as I'm sure it is to you, that most people, I would say, simply do not know how good they could feel. They're so used to feeling the way that they are feeling, they think that's normal. And still to this day, I've rarely found something as powerful as encouraging them to have, 10 days or 2 weeks where they have completely a whole food diet. They take away everything else. They just do that. For so many people, it's life changes. Go, oh, I didn't realize my mood could be better. My energy could be better. My sleep could be better. All these kind of things. And this is the message that you have been, I think for maybe 3 decades now, you've been trying to spread this message with the world, right? And it seems as though something is changing where people seem to be more receptive to this message, I believe, than ever before. So could you tell me a little bit about this 10-day detox program that you do? You obviously wrote a book about this a few years ago. Before you do that, you keep saying sugar and starch. For someone who doesn't know what you mean by that, because, of course, fruits has sugar in it as well. Could you just clarify what you mean by sugar and starch?
So sugar is sugar, sugar, just like a rose is but a rose by any other name. So it can be white sugar, it can be high fructose corn syrup, it can be honey, it can be maple syrup, it can be all the hidden sugars and ultra processed food like maltodextrin or dextrose and so forth. There's a million names for sugar, and you can literally, I think there's 50 different names for sugar that the food industry has come up with, because at least in America, you have to put the major ingredient first and then all the following ingredients after in an order of quantity. And so if you come up with 5 different kinds of sugar, then you don't have to have sugar as the number one ingredient of food, which most food is the number one ingredient. So sugar is basically sugar. Flour is basically what I'm talking about when I talk about starch. Refined flour, and it can be rice flour, it can be whole wheat flour, it can be white flour. But flour, for the most part, unless it's whole grain bread like they have in Germany, where you need a meat slicer to cut it, it's pretty much quickly absorbed starches. It's broken down, it's pulverized, and it's not needing digestion in order to be absorbed, and it just quickly spikes your blood sugar. So that's what I mean by starch and sugar. Now, sweet potatoes are starch. You can have, for example, a big starchy white potato. Probably not a good idea, but a small little tiny red potatoes or purple potatoes, what they have like in South America, they never had diabetes down there. They weren't obese. They ate potatoes, but they were a different kind of potatoes. They're called fingerling potatoes.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I mean by starch and sugar. Now, I'm a practicing physician. So what I see is that people have come with a whole host of different ailments. They're inflammatory problems, primarily obesity, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, digestive disorders, mood disorders, depression. These are all inflammation diseases, and they manifest in different ways in different people. But what I realized was that most people, if you remove the inflammatory foods and added the anti-inflammatory foods back in, that in a very short time, they would feel different. Now, most people walk around with what I call FLC syndrome. That's when you feel like crap. Basically, or there's a serious version called FLS that's more advanced, but the FLC syndrome is a very common problem. And it may be subtle stuff like, oh, I'm just tired, I have brain fog, my tummy's not always right, I have irritable bowel, my joints are a little achy, I get headaches, I don't sleep so good, whatever it is, I'm a little depressed, I have slow sex drive. It doesn't matter what the problem is. If you reset the body, I call it turning the body back to its original factory settings, it can happen very quickly. And it's just amazing to me. If I hadn't seen it literally tens of thousands of times with my own eyes, I would not believe it because it's so powerful and it's so simple. And so after doing this in my practice with patients for years and years and years, I'm like, I can't see that many patients in my lifetime. If I see 20,000 patients in my lifetime, that's a lot. But there's millions of people suffering. So I wrote this book, The 10-Day Detox, which lays out what to do for 10 days. Because I figured people can do anything for 10 days. If I say the 10-year detox, people are not going to do it. If I said the 10-month detox, the 10-week detox, they wouldn't do it. But essentially 10 days, you take out sugar, starch, ultra-processed food, alcohol, caffeine, and you eat real food, lots of vegetables, lots of nuts and seeds, lots of good quality protein, lots of good fats, avocados, olive oil, etc. And some maybe starchy vegetables, but not too much. And you can also have berries, which are low starch fruit. And you're right, fruit does have sugar, but it's in a complex matrix, so it's not quickly absorbed. So when you have something that's in a complex matrix, it takes a while for your body to break it down. It comes with other things like fiber. It's got phytochemicals in there, anti-inflammatory compounds. It doesn't spike your blood sugar as much. So whole fruit is fine. I mean, people are not going to eat 10 oranges, but they can drink a glass of orange juice, which contains oranges very quickly, right? So you want to be careful of that. So juice is not the same as eating the fruit. But that, again, that's just as bad. And I mean, it's kind of like soda with a few extra vitamins and minerals and fiber maybe in it. But the 10-day detox basically takes people through a very simple process. And we now have it online. You go to 10daydetox.com. And you can see the testimonials. Like, we're not making this stuff up. People just have incredible results. And it's in functional medicine, we call it an elimination diet.
Yeah.
I like to call it an addition diet because we add in all the things that heal you and we take out all the things that harm you. And it's really that simple. So you take out all the things like dairy, gluten, sugar, grains, beans, processed food, and you see what happens. Now, then you can add things back and see how you feel. So maybe after 10 days, you feel great. You want to keep going, you can. If you want to try to add things back, you can start to add things back slowly, 3 days at a time, and see what's triggering you. You go, oh, I added back wheat and gee, my stomach ache come back, or my headaches came back, or I added dairy back and I started getting pimples again. My skin was all clear. And then it started getting eczema or acne. So you can start to find out what your body's telling you. And I always say the smartest doctor in the room is your own body. It's going to tell you what you need if you listen to it. Most of us have just tuned it out.
Yeah.
Or we don't connect the dots. And it's amazing how many people who I've seen who are super smart, like top executives, leaders in the world, who have not made the connection between what they eat and how they feel.
And that's a really interesting point. The way that you set that 10-day detox diet up, this is where I think a lot of people get confused with foods. They only eliminate one thing at a time, right? So they might go, oh, I think dairy might be making my skin worse, for example. And so they go, well, what if I try 2 or 3 days without dairy? Oh, it wasn't dairy. Put it back in. Do you know what I mean? A lot of people don't realize it. They want to do one at a time and then put it back in. But there's real value, isn't there, at cutting it all out and then slowly reintroducing things one at a time.
100%. I think this is a big fallacy. Like in medicine, we've learned and we've been brainwashed to this. Just do one thing at a time. So you know what that one thing is causing, and then you know what to do. So only if you want to treat Alzheimer's, just give vitamin D and do that for 30 years and see if that works. And then just give vitamin E or give omega-3 fats or cut out sugar or whatever it is, take this drug. And it's just not the way the body works. The body's a system and you've got to unload the system from the toxic load. And the future of medicine is what you and I have been doing is functional medicine, or we call it systems medicine. And the fundamental framework, and this is from a textbook from Harvard. These guys wrote a book called Network Medicine. They said, really, we need to look for the multiple causes that are driving any particular one condition. It's not just one thing. And we need to create multimodal treatments, meaning it's not just one thing. You need diet, you need exercise, you need stress management, sleep, you need the right nutritional supplements potentially. You might need other therapies that can help be adjunctive. So it really is about understanding the holistic nature of how we need to treat the body. If I said broccoli is good for you and all you eat is broccoli, you would die, right? But that's not how our bodies work.
Yeah.
So I think it's really more simple. Is just take out the bad stuff, put in the good stuff, see what happens. Now, some people won't get better. And the reason they don't get better is because they have heavy metals, or they have mold, or they have Lyme, or they have some other more serious condition. But I've done this workshop where I do 30, 40 people around the world. We put them through this in just 5 days, not even 10 days. The average reduction in 5 days of eating this way of all symptoms from all diseases is 70%.
Wow.
Now, if there was a drug that could do that, it would be a multi-trillion-dollar best-selling blockbuster drug. But guess what, folks? It costs almost nothing. It's available to everybody almost on the planet. And it's totally doable by you without going to the doctor. And it's called food.
Yeah. For over 6 months now, I have been regularly consuming Ketone IQ, a clean shot of high performance energy. Ketone IQ contains exogenous ketones, basically ketones that we consume as opposed to ones that our bodies make, which basically means all of us can experience their benefits without needing to go on a ketogenic diet. There is mounting research on their ability to improve athletic performance, focus, metabolic health, mental clarity, and recovery. And I myself take it before I work out, before each conversation on this podcast, when I need some extra focus, and more recently on my national UK theatre tour, where I took it immediately before going on stage. I've been really impressed not only with its taste, but also how it makes me feel and perform. Ketone IQ is also consumed by many professional athletes and Tour de France cycling teams. And as a special offer for my podcast listeners, you can save 30% off your subscription order. Plus, you'll get a free gift with your second shipment. Fun stuff like a 6-pack, Ketone IQ merch, and more. All you have to do is go to ketone.com/live more or click on the link in the description box below. It's almost hard to not come to the conclusion that you simply do not know how many of your symptoms are related to food until you address your food. Right. And it is madness, isn't it, that people still go to their doctor today all over the world and they're being treated for symptoms that may well be related to food. Not always, but until you change the diet, you don't know. And I always say, listen, let's just figure out, as we've spoken on your show before, that these 4 pillars: food, movement, sleep, and stress. And let's just start with food. Let's just get these things all cleaned up as much as we can. And then let's see what's left. And a lot of the time, there's not much left, right? A lot of the time you realize, oh, wow, these are downstream symptoms from me not paying attention to the creation of health in my body. But of course, leads to that wider point, Mark, doesn't it? Whereby we're not taught as Western medical doctors how to create health. We're simply taught to treat disease.
That's right. That's right. I mean, that's exactly it. You nailed it on the head. If you go to the doctor and say, gee, I want you to help me optimize my health or create great health. They go, well, gee, you don't have any symptoms. Your labs are normal. Your exams are normal. There's nothing wrong with you. So go home. And if you're really feeling bad, then it must be you need Prozac. And the truth is that most people want to understand how to feel better and not just survive, but thrive. And for me, the goal here is to teach people how this meat suit that we've got works. We've learned a lot through science, a tremendous amount through medicine, but we haven't gotten into the clinic yet.
Yeah.
We haven't gotten into the average doctor's office yet. And so what we're trying to do is change that from 17 years to 17 seconds and get people quickly to kind of understand, here's how your biology works. If you had $1 million racehorse, would you feed it McDonald's a Big Mac and a fries and a Coke? No, you wouldn't. But that's what we do to ourselves. It's what we do to our kids. We wouldn't feed to our dog what we feed to our kids. Yeah. We literally would not. And so why do we think it's okay to feed to our kids? It's because the culture and predominantly the food industry has made us believe that it is good, that convenience is good, that it should be fine if it's ultra processed, that it's safe, it's shelf stable. If it's in the food, it's got to be safe because the government must be protecting us. Well, that is not true. The government is not protecting us, and especially in the United States. I think it's better in Europe. We're looking now at revising all of our standards for food safety and what should be in and out of the food.
Yeah. The problem is, Mark, though, and you're really speaking to this, and I know we've spoken about this before, but the culture around us, the food environment around us is so toxic that when you try and eat in a way that's appropriate with our evolution, right, in a way that our body is expecting to receive things, you almost come across like a health nut these days, right? Because the norm is so unhealthy that when you start to really try and eat well and, what oil did you cook that in? And what you come across as actually someone who's obsessed. But I don't think it is that you're obsessed. 93% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy. We're not that far behind in the UK. Normal is not what you want to be in 2025, is it?
No. And normal, just so people understand, is basically a statistical number. And it has to do with the averages in a population. So if you're a Martian landing in America today and you look at what is the normal weight of an American, it's overweight because 75% of us are overweight. So you and I would be anomalies. We'd be abnormal because we're probably at the 2 standard deviations below the mean in terms of weight, because the whole curve of normal is shifted over to the right, which means in English that we basically have normalized the bad thing, which is being overweight. And we think that it's okay.
Yeah.
But it's really not. And the foods we're eating, if our great grandmothers had to look at them, they wouldn't even recognize them as food, right? They wouldn't know what a Lunchable was or a Go-Gurt was or a Pop-Tart or Twinkie. I mean, they were like, what is this thing? I don't understand.
Why in your 10-day detox do you recommend that people cut out gluten and dairy? Because these are two things that seem to be quite controversial with doctors as to whether they should be cut out or not. But I'd love to hear from your perspective why those two are in there.
Well, it's not arbitrary. It's not because I just have some kind of vendetta against gluten or dairy. I think they're both delicious. I think the reality is that the wheat we eat and the dairy we eat is not the wheat we ate or the dairy we ate. And so our biology is really affected by the new versions of these that are now in our food supply that are creating havoc. We've seen a 500% or 400% to 500% increase in true celiac disease in the last 50 years. Now, this is a very serious disease. It's not just some little gluten sensitive. It's true damage to your gut, and you get very sick when you have this condition. And it creates a whole host of other autoimmunities. So why would that happen? Well, these two foods have been so modified by breeding, I wouldn't say by GMO, but just by breeding, and because of the way they're grown, that they have adverse effects on us. For example, wheat is mostly dwarf wheat, and this dwarf wheat is an incredible advance in agriculture, which won the Nobel Prize because it created a very sturdy, short wheat stalk with very dense, starchy grains. But the side effect of that was that it also has way more gluten proteins. Because when you breed plants, it's not like breeding humans. You get 23 chromosomes from your mom, 23 from your dad. You get, 23 pairs of 46 chromosomes. It's like 46 with 46, so it's like 92 if you're a plant. And so those genes make proteins, and they make more gluten proteins, and those gluten proteins turn out to be more inflammatory, and they cause leaky gut, they cause inflammation in the body, and they are linked to all sorts of issues that we have, dozens and dozens of different diseases. Same thing with dairy. We hybridize the cows, so modern cows have a different composition of the protein in there called A2 casein versus A1 casein. So modern cows have A1 casein, whereas heirloom cows and goat and sheep have A2 casein, which again is a lot less inflammatory. I mean, you look at the science around dairy, Dr. Ludwig and Willett from Harvard, two of the top nutrition scientists in the world, among the most cited ever, they both wrote an article together in New England Journal of Medicine, which is not like some third-rate hippie journal, but basically one of the most prestigious journals other than Lancet in the world. And it documented the science or the lack of science showing the benefit of milk and health. In fact, there was an adverse outcome for the most part. Milk didn't create strong bones, it weakened bones. It didn't make, if you drank skim milk, skinny kids. It made fat kids because they ate more because there was no fat. It's linked to autoimmune diseases, to type 1 diabetes, to cancer. So I think it's a very inflammatory food. And the way we raise these cows is often in feedlots with hormones. We milk them while they're pregnant, and they become very inflammatory. So a lot of times when people have congestions, allergies, digestive issues, eczema, skin issues, rashes, dairy, acne, these are often dairy issues. So I find it very easy if you just take out the two biggest culprits, even if you just did those two, that would be amazing. But you're right. If you just do one, let's say you're allergic to gluten and dairy, you just take out dairy or you take out gluten, you're not going to know which it was because you're still going to feel bad. until you take it all out. And that's why I like 10 days, because it's like resetting the clock, and it doesn't take that long. And then you can decide what you want to do.
Yeah. Mark, we're on gluten for just a moment. So you're saying that the concentration now of gluten in, let's say, bread is very different to how it was several decades ago. Okay. Yeah. You're saying that celiac disease is on the rise, but we also know that many people are self-reporting that they feel better when they go off gluten. Now, what's really interesting, we have seen a ton of people get better when you put them on elimination diets, right? But within the medical profession, there's still a view that if you do not have celiac disease, you should absolutely not be cutting out gluten from your diet, which I've always found a little bit odd and quite remarkable. It's not as if gluten per se has any health benefits. Like, give me more gluten to help me with my well-being. I understand that there are some gluten-containing foods which have got fiber, so I think some dietitians get concerned that if people are cutting gluten out, are they getting enough fiber? I know that's one of the concerns that's often raised, but what's your take on that? Why do you think there's a case for some people who do not have celiac disease to not eat gluten?
Well, celiac disease is defined as a biopsy-proven atrophy of your small bowel. So when you take a scope, you put it down your throat, you take a biopsy of your small intestine, and it looks flattened, that's celiac disease, okay? But there's a spectrum of disease, and this is where medicine just gets it 100% wrong.
Yeah.
You have the disease or you don't. You have diabetes or you don't. Now they have pre-diabetes. Oh, okay, because we're recognizing that's consequential in and of itself. It doesn't mean that you just might be at risk for diabetes. It means even though you have a blood sugar that's within the quote normal range, it's a little higher than normal, that still puts you at risk for heart attack, strokes, cancer, dementia, and everything else. There's now pre-hypertension, pre-autoimmune disease. And the phenomena is that gluten, like any other thing that can be a trigger for illness, the dose affects people, and different people are sensitive at different doses. And also people have sensitivities, even though they might not fully be celiac. Now, when you look at the literature, about 35% of the population has the gene for celiac, but it's not expressed fully unless it's about 1% of the population. But about 20%, I would say, this is just ballparking it, have some level of gluten sensitivity that they might not be aware of. So the idea is here that we should be paying attention to, one, how we feel, and that's the best barometer. Stop it for 3 weeks, start it again, and listen to your body. Like, don't let a doctor tell you what's right or wrong. Listen to how you feel. How's your stomach? How's your energy? How's your skin? How's your brain function? How's your sleep? How's everything else that matters to you? And if you also, look at antibodies, you can see there's a spectrum of antibodies. Like if you're diagnosed with celiac disease, you can be diagnosed by blood work. Let's say your gluten antibodies are 20 or more. That's considered celiac. But what if it's 19? What if it's 18? What if it's 17? Does that mean you're fine? No, not necessarily. If it's 0, you're probably okay. And I see many patients with 0 antibodies, but I also see a lot of people in that gray zone. And so if you're in that gray zone, it's worth doing an elimination diet to see if you're going to be affected by it or not.
Yeah. And then, this is so important. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because a lot of people, I know people who feel better off gluten-containing foods, but they're made to feel bad by the world around them. A lot of the time people are saying, oh, you don't have to see that. What the hell are you doing this? And it's this real misunderstanding that some people are a little bit sensitive. What you said there about how many people have the genetic predisposition for celiac but don't actually have the disease is really interesting. This idea that, genes load the gun, environment pulls the trigger, right? My dad had lupus. So he had antiphospholipid antibodies. He had 15 years, with kidney failure and the autoimmune disease lupus. I know I've got the genes that predispose to autoimmune disease, right? Including celiac. So for me, it's an interesting conundrum, Mark, to think about this idea that if you know you have the genetics that are necessary for you to get celiac disease, if you never ever consumed gluten, would you even get it in the first place? And again, these aren't the sort of things that we think about in medicine, but people think it's a restriction, it's too hard for people. But wait a minute, how do we know what's too hard for people? Let's give people credit. A lot of people are proactive about their health and actually are very happy to make changes when they know there's a benefit, right?
Totally. I think um, like I said, it's so important for people to pay attention to their own bodies. And doctors can be a good influence and can provide lab testing and guidance. But at the end of the day, you should be the CEO of your own health.
Yeah.
And you should be the one who's in charge of your biology. And you should be the one doing an N of 1 testing, which is probably the most valuable testing you can do.
I want to talk about testing because I know you're really excited about a new project that you've been involved with for a little while now. Just before we get to that, though, I heard on a recent interview, Mark, that your daughter is at medical school. So my question to you is, given how much information you've put out into the public domain over several decades now, you've been trying to change public's perception of health, medical schools, governments. Have you seen any evidence with your daughter that what medical students are being taught has changed?
No, zero.
Really?
No. I asked my daughter, what have you learned about nutrition? Well, we learned about amino acids and fatty acids. I'm like, what are you going to tell your patients to have for lunch? Nothing about nutrition, nothing about the microbiome, nothing about insulin resistance, nothing about environmental toxins, some of the most important drivers of the disease we're seeing today in modern society that doctors who are being trained today learn literally nothing about. Or if they learn anything about it, it's in a very academic way that's not clinically relevant, and they don't know how to address or treat or monitor. And so it's sad. She's going to become a surgeon where she really doesn't have to worry so much about it, although it does matter for surgery because you want your surgical patients to be healthy going in and going out. And so it matters on their health and their health status. But I think that it's sad. And so one of the things I'm working on is helping try to mobilize the U.S. government to mandate that nutrition training is critical for undergraduate and postgraduate education for medical doctors and residents. And hopefully that'll come to fruition, but it's going to be a pushback.
Yeah. It's interesting though, even this idea of nutrition education is challenging, isn't it? Because there's lots of different approaches to nutrition education. And then there's also, you can learn the theory of nutrition as a medical student, but that is also often very different from the actual practice of how you would do that with a patient, right? So it's challenging on multiple levels.
Yeah, I know. Food is the biggest cause of disease we're seeing in today's modern society. It's the biggest cure, and doctors know nothing about food. It's tragic. It's really tragic.
You know how much I believe in the power of small, intentional routines to transform your health. And one of my absolute favorites at the moment is to take a break mid-morning and have a cup of Peak's Sun Goddess Matcha. This fantastic drink contains L-theanine, a natural compound that keeps me calm and focused, and EGCG catechins, which help kickstart lipid metabolism and curb cravings. One of the things I love the most about Peak and what really sets them apart is their commitment to quality. Their Sun Goddess Matcha is organic, ceremonial grade, and quadruple tested for pesticides, heavy metals, and mold. And it's been crafted by 9th degree tea masters in Japan, ensuring it's the highest quality that you can find. If you're looking for a small change that can make a really big difference, I cannot recommend Peak's Sun Goddess Matcha enough. All you have to do is go to peaklife.com/livemore for your 20% off and a free starter kit. There's a reason that Peak has over 15,000 5-star reviews. Try it today and take advantage of their 30-day satisfaction guarantee. You either love it or you get your money back. Now, Mark, one of the things we've been talking about throughout this conversation is this idea that things are not black and white. And when you go and get your blood tests done at your medical doctors, usually, certainly in the UK, you're told it's either normal or abnormal. So I have used this example before on the podcast, but for anyone coming to this podcast for the first time, I want to just sort of frame it. And then I know you're doing a lot of work in America to try and change this. In the UK, we have different cutoffs for pre-diabetes to you guys in America. I believe in America, an HbA1c of 5.7 is pre-diabetes. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. So here, it's not until 6, right? So... for anyone who doesn't understand, right, type 2 diabetes is a condition where you have chronically elevated blood glucose. And the way it's diagnosed is with this blood test called the HbA1c, 2 to 3 month average of your blood sugar. In the UK, 6.5 and above, I think like America, is considered type 2 diabetes. 6 to 6.4 is considered pre-diabetes, which basically means, Mark, there will be hundreds of patients today in the UK who have got an HbA1c of 5.9, and they will be told that that is normal, which is crazy because in America that would be pre-diabetes. So just you go across the pond and here it's considered normal. But talk to me about this black and white issue in medicine and how you're trying to address this with your company Function.
Well, thank you. So yes, with Function Health, which is a company I co-founded that allows people access to their own health data. It's a health platform where you can get over 110 biomarkers for your health and get a deep dive into everything from hormones to nutrients to metabolic health to cardiovascular health to thyroid health, sexual health, to your nutritional levels, toxin levels. And it's a much deeper dive than you get when you go to your average GP and get, 19 blood tests, which is your blood count, your chemistry, and your cholesterol, and maybe urine tests. And those are only abnormal when you're really sick or in the hospital, except maybe cholesterol. And it's kind of crazy that we have, only this limited data set we look at when there's literally thousands and thousands of blood biomarkers that can be tracked. And there's many, many that aren't tracked that are really critical for disease. But when you look at this continuum concept, we work with Quest, which is a reference laboratory in America. And what was really interesting is they have data on thousands and thousands and millions of people. And they can analyze that data. And we were told, speaking back to the A1C, we were told that anything over 5.0, forget 6.0 or 5.7, just 5.0, there's a linear and steady progression of abnormal cholesterol or lipid biomarkers as your A1C goes up. So the more abnormal your blood sugar is, the worse your cardiovascular risk is from 5.0.
Even if the key point there for me, for people is, even if your result is considered normal or in the normal range, you're still at increased risk. I think there's really good research showing that an A1C of above 5.3 sequentially starts to increase your all-cause mortality, which is crazy that these have been reported as normal.
Right. It's totally true. And I think, we have the data on this. It just takes a long time to change. For example, in America, and we measure insulin, which is part of the key function panel. We measure your metabolic health, not just your cholesterol, but your particle size, the quality of your cholesterol, your ApoB, which is a very important predictor of your risk factor. It's probably one of the most predictive, more important than your LDL cholesterol, which is what everybody's testing. Look at statin therapy. When we look at the biomarkers, we're seeing insulin, which I think is probably one of the most important biomarkers. And it's less than 1% of all tests that are done in America by doctors that are sent to Quest, according to Quest. The insulin reference range they have is 18 as normal. And anything above that is abnormal, and anything below is normal. It should be 5 or less. Now, why they say it's 18 is because everybody in America is insulin resistant and pre-diabetic pretty much. So it's going to be skewed to being, quote, normal to be having high insulin, but it's not optimal. So we in Function Health actually provide for $499 easy access to 5 minutes sign up online, 15 minutes in the lab. You get a deep, dense data dump of your own biology and also explanations of what it means and what to do about it, not just what drug to take, but how do you change your diet for this and what types of exercise will help and how do you navigate stress and sleep and what are the right supplements that help modify these pathways. And so we get a very nuanced view of what's going on with your own biology that's personalized and that you own and that you can track over time and that people then can interact with and actually see the results change. And we've seen that over 2 years. We've just launched 2 years ago. We're one of the fastest growing companies in healthcare in the world. And we've seen just in the last couple of years how people just doing the program and learning about their data makes them change their behavior such that their biomarkers get better at the end of the 2 years or whenever they repeat their tests. So they get it tested twice a year, but we're tracking it over a couple of years now. And we see it's really quite remarkable. So for me, it's all about personalization. It's about owning your data. It's about being the CEO of your own health. It's about having access to information that you're not getting from your regular doctor. They're not checking your insulin. They're not checking your lipid particle size. They're not checking your ApoB, which is the most important cardiovascular risk predictor we have now. It's not checking your sex hormones. It's not checking your thyroid antibodies. It's not checking autoimmune disease. We're seeing running 33% of we have 150,000 members now. 33% have a positive ANA, which is a pre-autoimmune marker. 13% have thyroid antibodies, meaning their body has an autoimmune thyroid disease that's attacking their thyroid, making them feel bad. 46% have ICRP, which is inflammation in their body, which we know is linked to everything from depression to dementia to cancer to heart disease to pretty much everything that we have in our modern society. And we're seeing 67% with nutritional deficiencies. So we're like finding all these things that are latent and that are causing people to have FLC syndrome or feel like crap that they actually, if they knew about, could do something about. And that's really the whole purpose here.
Yeah, Mark, there's a couple of really interesting things there for me. Okay. First of all, when you were talking about breakfast or your 10-day detox diet, one of the things you said was that there's nothing better than doing this for yourself and paying attention to how you feel. And you were also talking about this idea that actually, you know, you can wait for the medical system to change or medical training to change. You could be waiting a very long time. And so why not take control, as you say, be the CEO of your health, start to do things. So people are doing that already with wearables, right? So a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, of course, can be a fantastic way of you kind of looking at your own breakfast and going, well, what is that doing to me, right? Is it spiking my blood sugar into the diabetic range every morning when I have my cereal, or is it relatively flat? I've been experimenting with this new product called Lumen, this breathalyzer where they can tell you whether you're burning fat or carbs, depending on the combination of oxygen and carbon dioxide, which again, it's about this personalization. You know, I, like you, am very health conscious, but even doing this has helped me change my behavior with my dinner, what time I have it, because I want to be waking up burning fat. I don't want to be waking up burning carbs, right? So there's this wider point here that we now are living in a world where we can start to take control of our health. Now, of course, we might need education on what all these markers mean, but that seems to be one of the key things that you're trying to do with Function. You're basically saying, listen, and I appreciate it's only available in America at the moment. And so we have a different model here with the NHS, which we can talk about. But of course, in America, you're saying for $499, you can have a ridiculous amount of blood testing done, which is going to give you, I guess, a bit like an MOT for your car, where you're literally looking under the hood. You also mentioned autoimmune disease, right? So if you could just touch on that for a minute, Mark, because I think people who listen to my show are understanding that blood sugar is on a continuum, and pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes is very late. You want to get involved much earlier than that. I don't think there's as much awareness of that with autoimmune disease. And you said quite an alarming statistic there about how many people who've done the test with Function Health have got evidence of being on that autoimmune spectrum. So could you just speak to that for a moment, please?
It's a third of everybody we've tested out of 150,000 people. That's shocking. And I don't know why. I think it's a combination of reasons, but you know, we think, oh, one day I get lupus, one day I get MS, one day I get rheumatoid arthritis, or one day I get whatever the autoimmune disease is, ulcerative colitis. And the truth is that this is a continuum. And when you're a good functional medicine doctor, you're taking a person's history from even before they were born. What was their mother's pregnancy like? What did her mother eat? What was the birth? Was it a C-section? Did they not get inoculated with good bacteria to colonize their gut microbiome where 60% of your immune system is? Did they breastfeed or not? And if they didn't breastfeed, what happens to their microbiome? Not a lot of good things. Did they get colic? Did they have infections of like ear infections? Did they take antibiotics? Did they have any gut issues or eczema or asthma or any of these things when they were younger? We often see the same story and unfolds over time. And by the time they're in their 30s and 40s, that's when autoimmune disease kicks in, particularly more in women than men. And so what we're seeing is this latent autoimmunity, this pre-autoimmunity in this population, because we've destroyed our microbiome, because we're exposed to environmental toxins, because we've taken loads of antibiotics, because we have lots of stress, because we have things like gluten, which has way more gliadin proteins than the ancient wheat. Where I did research for my book, Young Forever, I was eating Zea wheat, which was fueled Alexander the Great's, charge across the continent to take over the world. And it was a very nutrient-dense, high-protein wheat with very low gluten content. and very different forms of gluten. And also the way they processed it was different. The way they leavened it was different. It wasn't this super leavening stuff. So we see.
Did you feel a difference, Mark? Because are you sensitive to gluten in the US and you were not there? Or just help us understand that.
Yeah, well, we hear this story all the time, by the way. If you're American, you can be sensitive. You go to Europe, you can eat pasta in Italy, and you're fine. Why is that? One, because the Europeans don't usually have dwarf wheat. Two, they don't spray with glyphosate, which is a microbiome toxin. And so they're not exposed. And three, the way they leaven the wheat is much longer. And they'll often use sourdough or other things. So I was in Sardinia and they had sourdough bread. They gave me a 150-year-old sourdough starter. They had various kind of grain called grano capelli, which is, I'm pronouncing it terribly, but it's basically this form of wheat. That's this ancient form of wheat used by the shepherds in Sardinia when they would go out for long distances. So they were eating heirloom varieties that had very different properties and very different kinds of effects on the body. So yeah, when I go to Europe, I can eat more of that stuff. I don't eat it much in America because it's full of crap. And I think gluten is one of the big triggers for autoimmune disease. It's one of the big drivers. It's leaky gut, it's inflammation, it's environmental toxins. And so we've done all these things that cause our gut to be damaged, our microbiome to be damaged. Even though ultra processed food. I mean, Chris Van Tulleken is in the UK. You probably know him.
I do, yeah.
And he wrote a book called Ultra Processed People, and he talks about the harms of ultra processed food, which I think are primarily due to the starch and sugar content and some of the additives, and particularly emulsifiers. Now, emulsifiers make things smooth and create texture and so forth. And they're putting everything from plant-based milks like almond milk to breads and all kinds of stuff. And so these emulsifiers, they damage the gut and they cause leaky gut and they cause autoimmune disease. And we're eating 60% of our diet in America as these foods.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize, when I think about this, I think about this idea that, let's say gluten, for example. So you're saying the gluten now is much more concentrated than it used to be, right? So the amount you've been exposed to has gone up, but also our defenses, our microbiome is completely different from how it used to be, right? So I think it's possibly not just how gluten has changed, it's also the fact that the defenses in our body, the fences that would protect us, have been decimated, as we've covered on the show many times, how modernity has negatively affected the quality of our gut microbiomes, which is why, of course, there's so much focus these days on gut health. But Mark, if someone, let's say they do the function test and they realize that they're in that cohort who already has evidence of early autoimmunity, what can they then do?
Great question. So what's different about function is that the intel inside is really about the future of medicine. We can create a great tech platform. We can create a great user experience. We can create great interactive tools. We can create AI and machine learning and all these wonderful things. But if all we're doing is doing the same medicine better, we're not really advancing the paradigm very much. We're not really going to impact health that much. We're going to fix things around the margins, like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Probably not the solution here. What's really different was function health focused on root cause medicine. So if you have an autoimmune disease, rather than saying, oh, you have rheumatoid arthritis, take steroids, take anti-inflammatories, take biologics, take these drugs to shut off the immune system, we ask a different question, which is why? So traditional medicine is the medicine of what? What disease do you have and what drug do I give? This approach, root cause medicine, is really about why. Why do you have this? And what's going on? And so for autoimmune disease, it's a myriad of things, but we know the triggers for autoimmune disease. One is our microbiome and disturbances in our microbiome and leaky gut. That's probably the number one cause. And what causes a leaky gut in a lot of cases is gluten. And if you look at gluten, it can account for dozens, probably 100 different autoimmune diseases. And if you just look at the New England Journal of Medicine paper that's written 30 years ago, they listed 55 different diseases that could be caused by celiac or gluten issues. It can be environmental toxins. They call these autogens. So autoimmune inducing toxins. So it can be pesticides, can be heavy metals, can be glyphosate. They can cause autoimmune disease. It can also be infections. We know that infections like Epstein-Barr will cause MS, for example. So whether it's a toxin, an infection, a leaky gut, a food sensitivity, an allergen, gluten, we now can start to dig around. It can even be things like Lyme disease, or it can be mold. All these things can trigger autoimmune disease. So we need to be able to investigate what these are. And Function Health provides you with a roadmap, which you will not get from your nutritional doctor, on how to identify these problems and then what to do about them. And if a basic approach doesn't work to getting to the root cause, yes, then you need to go to the doctor. You might need medication, and that's fine. But it's really about starting with the right first principles of why, not what.
And I guess one of the key points there is if you don't do that test and get the result, you may not do anything differently in your life. You may go about thinking, hey, life's okay. I don't feel great. Maybe I'm a bit bloated. My energy's not great, but hey ho, I can manage until 5 or 10 years later. That's when you show up with rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, right? I think there is really good evidence, and it's been emerging for ages, that actually, just as we know, blood sugar is on a spectrum, and you don't get type 2 diabetes overnight. It's building up in your body 5, 10, maybe longer years in some people. Alzheimer's, Dale Bredesen, last time I spoke to him, said Alzheimer's starts 30 years, generally speaking, before the diagnosis, right? By the time you get the diagnosis, it's been going on for a long period of time. And I guess that's the principle here, which is you want to empower people to sort of find this stuff early so they can turn the ship around, so they don't end up with full-blown disease somewhere in the future, right?
Absolutely. That's the whole point, is you don't want to wait till things have already gone really bad. You want to get things early, and the sooner you can get them, the better you are. And that's really the purpose of Function Health, is to help people to get early diagnosis and identification of issues that they wouldn't have known otherwise. And we're seeing everything from just, identifying people with prediabetes that they didn't know of, or pre-autoimmune disease, to finding people with pituitary tumors that were affecting the quality of their life that they didn't know they had, which you can tell from a simple blood test, or cancer that they didn't know they have through our cancer liquid biopsy screening test, which you can find 50 different cancers. And that's really important, because you want to know where you're headed. You don't want to wait till you get there to find out. Benjamin Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so that's where we're headed in medicine. It's predictive, personalized, preventive, and it's participatory. You have to do it yourself.
Do any critics say, Mark, that actually this sort of testing may create health anxiety and causes more problems than it solves?
100%. I mean, listen, anytime you come up with a new idea, anytime you try to challenge the existing paradigm, you're going to get critics. And we've certainly got critics, and I'm not so worried about that. I've seen this for 30 years in functional medicine. What I do, we do a lot of diagnostics because we want to find out what's going on in the person's biology so we can optimize it. We want to create health, not just treat disease. And so, yes, you might create an uncertainty or an anxiety about something, but I'd rather do that and find out you don't have anything wrong than miss something and have you have some disease that's really incurable at some point later on.
Okay, so Mark, not all my audience live in America. For those who do live in America and are thinking, okay, I can afford that, I would like to do that, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah. So, basically what we're talking about is in American dollars, it's $1.37 a day for the basic membership, which includes twice a year testing of over 110 biomarkers and 60 a half year. And it's $15,000 worth of diagnostics that we've been able to kind of get the prices down, because there's such price elasticity in the market. In America, it's kind of crazy. I don't know if it's like that in the UK, but you could imagine buying a Toyota Camry on one lot that's $20,000, another lot that's $100,000, another lot's at $10, another lot's at $1 million. That's kind of like the pricing in America when it comes to stuff. So we've been able to get the prices really affordable for people. And they just have to go to functionhealth.com and /live better. And they can sign up and get in and get access to the platform. We have like 500,000 people on the wait list, so we don't want to have your listeners wait for that. So if you go to functionhealth.com /live better, you'll be able to get an early access and jump in and jump the wait list and see what's going on in your biology, and then you can do something about it.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I appreciate that for my US listeners who want to take advantage of that. Let's broaden it out now for people all around the world, even people in America who, let's say, can't afford that, or people in other countries of the world who go, actually, you know what, that all sounds great, but that's not available yet where I live. Can we just go through 5 or so of the tests that you think are most impactful for people They're tests that can be commonly done at their regular doctor, perhaps they're not. But, what are some of those lower cost tests that we can help people with all over the world at the moment?
Sure. Well, I'm going to answer two parts. The first is the lower cost test. I think that there's some basic things that everybody should get. You need a lipid fractionation test. It's not your normal cholesterol, but it looks at the quality of your cholesterol and the size of your cholesterol. And that, again, is not that expensive. ApoB, which is a type of cholesterol particle, very important for being a predictor of heart disease. Insulin, measuring your blood sugar. Obviously, your A1C is very important. Vitamin D, I would see very important. And then, we can kind of go down the list of things that are more or less important. But those things can make a huge difference if you just learn what those are for your nutritional metabolic health, if you're doing the bare minimum of 4 or 5 things. What I'll say is what's coming is because our platform has got so much data, literally tens of millions of data points on 150,000 people and growing at an astronomical rate, we're going to be able to soon be able to predict based on your history and your own data, what's going on with you, even necessarily not having to do as extensive lab tests. Now, the lab tests will be helpful, but if you're in a place where you're in a country where you can't get access to care, where there isn't a lab, where you don't have enough access to capital to do this, or the price is too high, you will be able to actually query your own biology by putting in your medical history, by putting in your past medical records, whatever tests you did have, and put it in there, and then it will learn from your data what is right for you and allow you to personalize your care. So that's where we're going. We want this to be available to 8 billion people.
Yeah, no, I love that. Information is not enough to make change in your life. You have to take action. So to help you take action after watching this video, I've created a free nutrition guide for you. This contains the 5 most important practices I've seen in over 2 decades of seeing patients. They work for you no matter what your dietary preference. There's a step-by-step action plan to help you implement those changes in your life. If you want to receive that free guide right now, just click on the link in the description box below. It's exciting what AI and all this sort of, machine learning is going to do to actually how we even view health and look at it and predict our potential outcomes in the future. Those 5 tests you mentioned, let's just quickly go through them. I'd love for you, if you can, to provide what you consider optimal ranges to be. Okay. So help us understand, Mark, from your experience, when it's vitamin D, what do you like to see?
What I like to see is at least 45 nanograms per deciliter or more. And between that and 75 to 100 is pretty safe and good. So that's an important number because that regulates bone density, cardiovascular health, brain health, immune health. Again, flu vaccine. If your vitamin D level is optimal, you have a 75% reduction in your risk of getting the flu, which is more than the vaccine. Now, I personally have never gotten the flu, and I make sure my levels are that high. So I think it could be coincidence, but I've been around a lot of people with the flu, and I think it's quite amazing how powerful this nutrient is, which is really more like a pro-hormone.
Okay. So that's vitamin D. Then we went to HbA1c, this average blood sugar marker that certainly in the UK, anyone can get on the National Health Service. It's a very cheap test. What do you like to see as a level there?
I like 5.5 or less. If people are 5.5 or less, I'm happy. If I get people who are 5, I'm thrilled. But, I recently did mine. It was 4.8. I was happy about that.
Well, that's amazing.
For a 65-year-old, where 1 in 2 65-year-olds pretty much have diabetes or prediabetes. So it's probably worse than that, actually.
Can I just ask you, you're 65, you're fit, you're well. What is it you attribute your A1C of 4.8 to? I know it's a combination of things, but that is lower than most patients in most practices.
It's not rocket science. It's, keeping your body composition optimal, not having belly fat by reducing starch and sugar or cutting it out dramatically, regular exercise, getting enough sleep, managing your stress. It's not that hard. I mean, it sounds like a lot, but it's not rocket science. It's just the trigger is starch and sugar. So I make that a treat, an occasional treat, not a daily staple.
Okay. So you said vitamin D, A1C, insulin, right? So when you want people to test their insulin, is this any time of the day or is this a fasting insulin that you want?
Well, fasting insulin is very good. Now, I don't know if it's available in the UK yet, but there's a new test, and we offer it with Function Health, which is revolutionary. It's called a insulin resistance score. And it's a new way of looking at insulin resistance, which is the fundamental pathology underlying most chronic diseases, from heart disease to cancer to diabetes to dementia and even depression. And what this measures is using fasting insulin plus a C-peptide level. Now, what is C-peptide? C-peptide is the precursor molecule for insulin. So using a technology called mass spec, which is an old laboratory technology, but it's a little more expensive than regular lab testing, they're able to actually identify the level of insulin resistance in a patient, which is as good as any research-based tool that we use to identify insulin resistance, which is what we call a euglycemic clamp test, which no one would want to undergo. They do it in animals, but it's a pain in the ass test, or a glucose tolerance test with insulin, which is better, but still not as good. And this is just a simple blood test in the morning. And if I could get everybody on the planet to do this and see what their number was and try to improve it, I think we'd solve a lot of our health crisis, because it's a beautiful, simple test. And I think that's really good. But if you just can measure insulin, which is very inexpensive, like $5, $10 or less, you're talking a level should be under 5, ideally.
Is this fasting insulin?
Fasting insulin.
Okay.
Fasting insulin. Like, I had a guy the other day, was fasting insulin was 39. I almost, like, my eyes came out of my head. It was so high. I've seen higher levels, but usually in very young, very obese people who are pancreas are just pumping out huge levels of insulin. They're drinking, like a 2-liter or 3-liter bottle of soda every day. And so 5 or less is the ideal. 5 to 10 is sort of intermediate. Over 10 is not good. But again, the reference range in our lab here is 18. And now in the function educational content, we'll say, here's the reference range, and here's the optimal range, and here's how you get to optimal, and here's how you get to optimal, because they're different for some. Like, if your sodium is optimal, it's normal. It's like there's a very narrow range. Or calcium. These are things in your blood test that don't really have normal or optimal. There's just one reference range. But the things that are lifestyle related or diet related, there are ranges.
Yeah. Let's just relate this back to how we started the conversation, Mark, talking about breakfast, right? And so we've mentioned blood sugar, we mentioned type 2 diabetes, you've mentioned insulin, right? So we're saying that type 2 diabetes is quite late. By the time you've had that, there's been problems going on for a period of time. I've also mentioned HbA1c, this average blood sugar marker that you've also shared what you like to see with your patients. But even that is a late marker, isn't it? Which is, of course, where insulin comes in.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing to happen is your insulin goes up after a meal. The second thing that happens is your insulin goes up fasting. The third thing that happens is your blood sugar goes up after a meal. The fourth thing that happens is your blood sugar goes up fasting. That's when we usually pick it up, at stage 4. We don't even look at any other things. So we're way late in picking up problems with your blood sugar and insulin, because we're not looking at these other factors. So you can do a 2-hour glucose tolerance test with glucose and fasting insulin, and 1 and 2 hour glucose and 1 and 2 hour insulin. That's helpful. But this new insulin resistance score is going to make that obsolete. And I think with a lot less pain, because it's like drinking 2 Coca-Colas to get your blood sugar and insulin to do gyrations. So it's important to keep your numbers in an optimal range for insulin. Just by the way, there's an easier test. If you look in the mirror and you got belly fat, you probably have the problem. You don't even need a blood test.
Yeah, well, look, this is, it's important stuff that we talk about and we help people with, because a lot of people are struggling with their health and well-being. They're trying their best. They're trying to consume information. They're trying to apply it in a world that doesn't make it that easy for them. But this thing about insulin is so interesting, because we talk about prevention, and everyone loves to talk about, prevention's more important than cure and all this kind of stuff. But if you look at medical practice in the UK, we don't really do prevention. We kind of, we think looking at your blood pressure is prevention. And of course, yes, keeping your blood pressure in the right range is important. But these things, you mentioned a term before, pre-hypertension, early on in this conversation, right? What does that term mean? Because I'm trying to get this idea across to people that actually, when medicine gets involved with you, that is quite late. That is why doing these markers regularly and earlier and having someone being able to interpret it for you, or an app or a program that does that, is basically you taking control of your health at a much earlier stage, isn't it?
100%. We really want to get people early in the continuum of disease. And this is a problem with traditional medicine, is we do not think about disease in continuums. Just like, diabetes, we've started to with prediabetes because the data showed it, or blood pressure with pre-hypertension. Normal blood pressure should be 140 over 90. Then it's like 120 over 80. Now maybe optimal is 115 over 75. So what is the level at which there is no disease, right? What is the level at which you're never going to get a stroke or a heart attack, right? And that is a very different number than what is, quote, normal. And that's really what I want to shoot for. I don't want to be average. I want to be optimal.
Yeah. Okay. The two more tests that you mentioned that let's go through. ApoB, you're saying a really powerful predictor of your risk of cardiovascular disease.
Yeah.
Where do you like to see ApoB levels in your patients?
So just to back up, what is ApoB? Well, if you don't have the ability to do what we call lipoprotein fractionation, which is a more complicated test where you look at particle size of your cholesterol and HDL and triglycerides and the number of particles, it's not always available. It's not that expensive, but doctors are loath often to order it. ApoB is a surrogate marker for that. And ApoB is a lipid particle, or apolipoprotein B, for all the non-good cholesterol types of particles. So all the small particles, all the triglyceride particles. So it's a surrogate marker that you're heading in the wrong direction. And it's probably far more predictive, not probably, it is far more predictive than LDL cholesterol, which is what most doctors look at. And the level you should have is under 90, but ideally probably under 70. And if you have cardiovascular disease, maybe under 50. In other words, if you've already had a heart attack, you want to drive it even lower to see regression. So we're looking at levels of 100, 110, 150, in people. And so, like I said, with Function Health, we see, I think 51 or 56% of people who do the function panel have an abnormal ApoB above the reference range from the lab, not what I would say is optimal.
Yeah. Mark, make the case to someone, if you don't mind, someone who's listening to this and goes, okay, listen, either I don't live in America, or I can't afford, or I don't want to spend a lot of money on blood testing, right? And they're thinking, well, look, I feel okay. Why can't I just go about doing what I'm doing, go and see my doctor for a medical once a year, and if he or she tells me everything's okay, whether it's function or whether it's these 4 or 5 simple tests that are available all over the planet, make the case to someone why you think they would benefit from doing these tests early.
Look, it's really simple. How do you feel and how do you look? If you feel great and your body composition, meaning you look great in the mirror, meaning you don't have no belly fat, you might be okay. And you don't even have to potentially even go further than your doctor's office to do the most basic things. So if you want to just get to the shortcut without any additional testing that you get at your doctor's office, it would be pretty simple. They're going to check a cholesterol profile. So make sure you look at numbers that they don't particularly look at, which is your number of triglycerides divided by your HDL. Now, we say good and bad cholesterol. HDL can be good and bad. LDL can be good and bad. So I don't like the good and bad reference. But basically, triglyceride over HDL is a number that almost everybody's going to get on their basic checkup. If that number starts to creep over 1 or 2 or 3, you're heading in the wrong direction when it comes to your insulin resistance. It's one of the first things to go wrong. It's very predictive. Very predictive. Not quite as good as an insulin resistance score, but it's very predictive of having a heart attack. More than LDL, by the way. And that's something you can get. And then look at your blood sugar. If it's between 85 and 100, and again, your reference ranges are different in the UK, but if it's, because I train in Canada, so it was 40 years ago, I forgot all those reference ranges, but I know the American ones. So it was between like 85 and 100, you're heading toward, scope creep in terms of your blood sugar regulation, even if they don't measure insulin. If it's over 100, for sure, you're already in trouble. So make sure you pay attention to that. That's going to be on your annual checkup. And if you want to just get insurance about what you should basically take without having to worry about a lot of things, take a good multivitamin, take a good fish oil, EPA, DHA about 1 gram a day, and take a good vitamin D between 2 to 4,000 units a day, vitamin D3. And if you combine it with K, that's better. And we're talking literally pennies a day to be able to do this if you can't afford most other things. That alone will help you identify and solve for many of the problems that people are having. You'll get the B vitamins were low, and you'll get potentially a little bit of zinc. You'll get maybe there's some iron and some multivitamins, depending on which they are, particularly for menstruating women. But we'll deal with a lot of the deficiencies. Magnesium often is a big deficiency. You might need a little extra magnesium, but you can just cover your bases by doing those things and just eating protein and fat for breakfast, cutting out starch and sugar for the most part if you can, and trying to kind of move your body, do all the things you write about in your books, and that you do so beautifully and elegantly. So you don't have to go crazy, but the basics are really going to solve most of the problems for you.
Mark, you released your book, Young Forever, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago now. And when it came out, we had a quite wonderful conversation. What's changed in the last 2 to 3 years in the sense that if you were writing the book today, what would you add that wasn't in there?
Well, I think there's some really interesting stuff around the margins that I don't think really is ready for prime time yet, that there's more and more research on. For example, therapies that are being looked at for longevity, like plasmapheresis, or things like stem cells or exosomes, or even things, for example, that are being researched in certain labs, like Altos lab from the Jeff Bezos' funding, or Sam Altman's lab, that are looking at these things called Yamanaka factors. And when it comes to longevity, we're going to be able to, most of us, do well and live maybe 100 healthy years, which is our goal at Function Health, if you follow the foundational principles that you and I talk about.
Yeah, wow. It's pretty exciting to see all the research that's there. Going back to testing for just a minute, when I was in LA in November at our friend Darshan Shah's clinic, he did a full set of bloods for me, and in that he included BPA.
Oh, yeah.
Now, just to sort of highlight the point of how testing can be so powerful, I am pretty proactive about my health. It's my career, it's what I talk about, it's what I do. When those blood tests came back, my BPA levels were in the red.
Wow.
Right? I was looking at them going, what the hell is going on? How do I have this much plastic going around my body, right? Or the BPA at least. And knowing that has completely changed my behavior. Since then, I think once when I was traveling, I drank water out of a plastic water bottle, but I pretty much haven't done it. I never, ever anymore will get a takeaway hot drink in one of those plastic cups from a coffee shop or whatever. I'll either not have it or I'll take my own flask or my own cup. But this highlights the benefit of testing, right? When I saw that in my body, I'm like, okay, Rangan, this stops now. Do you know what I mean? So I think I'm just sharing that to kind of highlight how it's power, isn't it?
Yeah, information is power. And I agree. I think it's so important to know what you're exposed to. And with Function Health, you can check your BPA levels, which is bisphenol A that causes diabetes and potentially cancer and hormone disruption. And it's in credit card receipts. It's in, and automatic teller receipts. When you get your gas or your petrol, as you call it, you get that receipt. It's all on those receipts. So you don't want to be touching those things. People say, you want a receipt? I'm like, no, email it to me.
So Mark, I haven't done yet an episode on microplastics. I hope to very shortly, and the potential impact on our health. But I also don't want to scare people. So you just said a lot of things there. Receipts, takeaway coffee cups, all these things, are loaded with this stuff. And especially when the hot water goes into that takeaway coffee cup, once you start delving into this, you can see it's everywhere. Yes, you can reduce your exposure, but also what's your take on things like sauna therapy? And of course, if people have, access to it, which of course not everyone does, what are some of the other things people can do to help them detoxify a lot of the toxins that are there in the modern environment?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I've been talking a lot about this, particularly with the LA fires, because the LA fires release so many toxins in the environment. not just BPA and heavy metals and dioxin, but volatile organic compounds and pesticides and plastics. I mean, the amount of toxins released were just staggering. And people have had, even Brian Johnson actually report on this, how his levels of these compounds skyrocketed after the LA fires. So I did a whole seminar on how do you reduce your exposure, right? So you air filters, filter your water, be careful when you go outside. If the air quality is not good, use a mask, an N95 mask, which is not fun. But there are a lot of things your body already does to get rid of these things. So I call it the triple P system, the pee, poop, and perspire system. You want to, drink a lot of fluids so you're well hydrated and peeing out a lot of these things. And the solution to pollution is dilution, as we learned in med school. You probably learned that, right? When you have an infection, you just put a lot of fluids and clear it out. Second is you want to make sure you're going to the bathroom a lot. And that means lots of fiber. Flax seeds are great. Chia seeds are great for going to the bathroom. Magnesium is great. And also lots of phytochemicals that have detoxifying compounds in them, like the broccoli family, garlic and onions, and pretty much any colorful fruit or vegetable is going to have compounds that facilitate either antioxidant defenses or detoxification pathways. And then you want to do things that can even take you up a level from just, doing things like that, like sauna. Sauna therapy can be very, very effective. And that's something very important. And then there's certain supplements that can be very effective, like N-acetylcysteine, which helps support glutathione, the main body's detoxifier. And then there's even more advanced therapies to help cellular detoxification, which uses cell membrane replacements, like phosphatidylcholine, to replace all the toxins that get embedded in your cells. That's a much deeper can of worms we can talk about someday. But, from a therapeutic point of view that you can do with a doctor, there's certain things you can do. But on your own, it's just, cleaning up your household products, cleaning up your toxins in your food, trying to be organic if you can, filtering your water, ideally getting an air filter if you're exposed to bad places, avoiding things you can avoid, like plastic cups and bottles. And I mean, BPA is not a microplastic, but it's lining plastic containers. So you're getting microplastics along with it. So we basically want to reduce our exposures. We want to maximize our excretion. And that's what it comes down to.
Yeah. And I guess, if you don't have a sauna, if you're doing things where you're sweating regularly, you're at least excreting stuff through the sweat. And of course, that highlights the need to open your bowels regularly, right? Because that's the way that actually people excrete stuff and sort of detoxify from the body. Mark, just to finish off, you've obviously been pioneering in the longevity space for a while. You're doing a great job with yourself in terms of, the difference between your chronological age and your biological age. I don't know what it is these days, but you were pretty young biologically last time I spoke to you. I'm really fascinated as you get older year on year, despite everything that you know and all the things that you're doing, how do you actually think about your own mortality and death?
Well, I'm not one of those people who wants to live forever and not die. I think that mortality is what makes life so sweet and beautiful, because eventually it's going to end. And it makes me treasure every day more as I get older. It also makes me prioritize what matters and the things I care about, and not do things that I don't really think are going to be the things that matter to me. And so that's really shifted for me. Also, I've realized that it takes more time to invest in my health. When I was younger, I could do anything and, was sort of resilient, but now I have to make sure I exercise. I have to make sure I eat well. I have to make sure I take my supplements. I have to do the basic things to optimize my health. It's like if you have a 50-year-old car, it's not going to run as well as a car you drive off the lot, but it can still drive well if you take care of it.
Yeah. And finally, Mark, I understand when I was doing my research for this conversation that before you went to medical school, you studied Buddhism at university. And that's really interesting to me. I also know that you trained to be a yoga instructor many, many decades ago, before it was big in the wellness space, right? So I'm really interested as to your life journey and the fact that you were a very early adopter, certainly in this kind of online wellness space, into yoga. You studied Buddhism at a very young age. How did what you learned back then influence how you think about health today?
Oh, tremendously. I mean, I think what I learned about was a lot of the science of creating health without even knowing about it, through just understanding what it took to create a health through the practice of yoga. which has a lot of, built-in philosophy around, meditation, movement of the body, about diet and so forth. When it comes to Buddhism, that was more about healing of the mind, but it also talked about, Tibetan medicine and healing medicine, which is actually how I started getting into medicine. And I also think that the things I studied on the margins really also influenced me, which were really about systems thinking, not looking at a reductionist view of the world, but looking at how everything's connected and how everything relates to everything else, and looking at ecosystems, both biologically and also in other networks. And so network thinking was always a part of my kind of predisposed mind. And so when it came to medicine, I just didn't get the reductionist model at all. And when I personally got sick when I was in my 30s, I had to kind of resurrect myself. And it required me to really step out of the bounds of what I learned in medical school and step into a new framework, which looked at the body as an interconnected network where all the systems were interdependent and interacting, and I had to optimize them and understand them in order to be healthy. And that's what I did. And that's really what led to my career. And that's what has been the foundation of my teachings and my work for the last 40 years.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Mark, for someone who's stumbled across our conversation and has been inspired by what they've heard from you, and they're thinking that, you know what, I really need to do something now with my health. I've neglected it for far too long. I want to be as healthy and as well as Mark Hyman when I'm 65. What are those final take-home points that you would say to that person?
Steady wins the race. I think, for me, I've never gone into shape and out of shape. I mean, I've had moments where I've had more or less, but I've always eaten well. I've always exercised. I've always focused on the basics, and the dividend pays dividends. And if you invest, $10 when you're born, it's going to end up being a lot of money, even if you don't add any more money to it by the time you're 65. And so it's really about, starting as soon as you can, starting to invest little bits every day, whatever it is, just slight improvements to your diet, little bits of exercise, stress management practices. I know this new device someone sent me, which is essentially 2 minutes a day on your vagus nerve with a little vibratory stimulator. That's getting a huge stress reduction reset on your nervous system. So I'm like, okay, 4 minutes a day, I could probably do that. So there's little bits and bites that people can do. And then as you get more inspired, you want to do more, then do more. But I think, if you're struggling, you've just got to start where you are and take the first step. And for me, we talked earlier about the 10-day detox diet, but it is such a profound and radical shift in your biology in such a short time. So you don't have to believe me. You don't have to listen to me. You don't have to believe you. Listen to your body. What happens when you take out the crap and you put in the good stuff? Your body will be smarter than any one of us and tell you what to do. And then you listen or not. And they say, well, like I know, for example, if I have a glass of wine, I'm not going to sleep as well. But I'll know that and I'll make that conscious choice. But I would say now that I know that information, I do it probably a lot less, maybe once a month, every few months. So it's really now a conscious choice to do something where I know it might impact me, like have some ice cream or whatever. I'll make that choice, but it's with the knowledge of how it's going to impact me.
Yeah, Mark, I love that. Mark, I always enjoy talking to you. You've been helping so many people around the world for so long. Thank you for coming back on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Rangan. It's been great.
If you enjoyed that conversation, then I think you are really going to enjoy this one.
Who wants to live longer if you're not able to have good brain health? You could live to 150, 200, go for it. But if your brain isn't working, it's not worth living.